We are going through a journey of following in Jesus' footsteps. The task of the church is to make disciples of Jesus Christ for the transformation of the world. And we found that a disciple is one who follows Christ, who follows the teacher and does what the teachers did. And in the old days in Jerusalem, when Jesus was here, they would follow in the footsteps, literally in the sand, try to place their foot exactly where that rabbi had walked in front of them, walking exactly as he, keeping the stride of that rabbi, walking so close. It was the hope that the dust that would be kicked up by that rabbi would come onto them, that they followed so closely to their teacher. When we come to the Sermon on the Mount is probably the most popular of Jesus' teachings. We've all probably heard pieces of it before. If you haven't read Matthew 5 through 6 and 7 on your own fully, we have read in parts the Sermon on the Mount. The Beatitudes themselves, blessed are they, is something that Gandhi actually fashioned his life after. So they're famous in other religions as well as in ours, and following the teachings of the Sermon on the Mount really gives us the best capsulated picture of what kingdom living looks like. This is what a disciple of Jesus Christ should be living. And we could focus on that Sermon on the Mount, Matthew 5 through 7, all of our lives, seeking God to bring that into our life. That would be enough, some theologians say. It is the picture of what kingdom living looks like. So in Matthew 7, Jesus ends this sermon with a parable. And that parable is about the two different houses. One is built on the sand, and the storms come and destroy the house. One is built on the rock, and in the storms, it stays strong. It never fails. It is there even after the storm. And most of us take it as, well, Jesus is contrasting and comparing those who follow his teachings. They're the ones that live and build their house on the rock. And those who don't follow the teachings of Christ, those who are non-believers, they make their house in the sand. And everything fails. I don't think that's where it is in the scriptures. In the Sermon on the Mount, Jesus seems to be contrasting something different. And I think we have to go back a little bit into the history of the Sermon on the Mount. What is Jesus doing there? Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John continually connect the story of Jesus to the story of Israel in the Hebrew scriptures. So, for example, in Matthew, at Christmas time, right after Christmas time, we tell the story of the wise men who come from the east and come and greet the baby Jesus. And we find that they stop over at Herod and say, we're looking for the King of the Jews. And Herod gets nervous. And after they visit the baby and they get told by an angel to go a different way, Herod is angry and he sets out to kill all the babies in Bethlehem in order to get rid of this threat to his reign. That mimics Egypt killing all the male children of Israel when they were slaves in Egypt. Jesus and Joseph and Mary flee to Egypt, and then they are brought out of Egypt after Herod dies. And that mimics and reflects the story of Israel going into Egypt at the end of Genesis and coming out in the Exodus to freedom with Moses. And so there's all these connections. When we come to the Sermon on the Mount, this is Israel and Moses coming to Mount Sinai. What happened at Mount Sinai? Mount Sinai is the Ten Commandments. The law comes to God's people. And what really is happening is God is establishing covenant. I will be your God. You will be my people. We will be in relationship. I will protect you. I will care for you. I will provide for you. And I will lead you. Israel says yes. We will then, in turn, live like we are people of God, which means to have a holy Sabbath, to take a day off. It means to not murder. It means to not commit adultery. It means not to lie. And we can go through all 10 commandments there. This is what it looks like to be people in relationship with God. But something happens between Mount Sinai and the days of Jesus. Religious people have a habit of building traditions that are good, to adding things to how they experience their faith. They fill their faith with more stuff. The Israelites had added to the law so much so that you wouldn't break the Sabbath. They would add extra laws. My Old Testament professor would said it was building fences to keep people from getting anywhere close to breaking that law, so they added fences to it. And to this day in Israel, when you go there and it's on the Sabbath, all of the lights on all the floors, the buttons on the elevators are pressed. You stop at every single floor because it would be work for you to press the button. And so there's these extra observances to keep the law. The religious people had added so much that the law became burdensome. They filled it with good stuff, but it wasn't the stuff that invited people to experience God. It wasn't the stuff that was actually going to work in them to change their heart. Because the purpose of the law was not just to give you something to check off and say, see how holy I am. The law was supposed to change our hearts, so that we would not just not murder someone, we would also have love for them. That we would actually bless those who cursed us. That we would do good to those who did evil to us. Jesus in the Sermon on the Mount is saying, you filled it with a lot of stuff that is getting in the way of you experiencing God. Because those fillers keep us from feeling the need to change. You know, I'm checking the box. I haven't murdered, I haven't committed adultery, I haven't lied, and we can just check that box, and I've been to church, and I've done this, and we can feel good about ourselves and still inside have unforgiveness, still have inside selfishness, still have inside stuff that breaks relationships still. But we look good on the outside. Jesus at the Sermon on the Mount is saying there's fillers, and we need to dig through that. The fillers, it's kind of like when you go to Texas Roadhouse or Olive Garden. What's the first thing you get? rolls and breadsticks. And it's on purpose because they want you to leave feeling stuffed. They want you to be full when you leave so that you come out and you're going, oh, I couldn't eat another thing. Well, but you filled up on all the appetizer there. You filled up on the bread, not on the substance for which you came for. And so sometimes in religion, we can fill up on the stuff and not get the substance, the Christ, the experience of God that we came for. And Jesus is challenging this. Jesus is saying that house on the rock are those who are listening to his teaching, contrasted with the house that is on the sand, that is the religious people. Because as we go through the Sermon on the Mount, we start hearing a contrast between the religious people and Jesus' teachings. The religious people of Jesus' time would have been wealthy. They would have had power. They had fine clothes. They would pray in public. They would make sure you knew they were fasting. They would openly show you how much money they were giving to God in the temple. They would flaunt how holy they were, and they would point their fingers at anybody who was not as holy as them. And so we get this contrasted with the Beatitudes. While the Pharisees and religious leaders might be able to sit there and say, look at me, I've done this, this, and this for God. Jesus says, blessed are the poor in spirit, those who know that they need God, those who know that they need community. They're the blessed ones, not the ones who look like they've got it all straightened out, not the ones who pick themselves up by their bootstraps. Blessed are those who realize their need. Blessed are the meek, not the ones who have it all and look like they have it all and flaunt what they have. Blessed are the meek, those who might be able to afford more, but don't show it, and also actually realize that they can live without and give to those in need. Blessed are those who are peacemakers, not those who go around pointing their fingers at how bad and wrong everybody is. It's not that we can't sit there and fight for justice and say this is what's right, but you do it in a peacemaking way, in a way that brings health and wholeness. And so Jesus is contrasting those religious people. Get into chapter 6 and you get it even more. When Jesus sits there and says, at the end of chapter 5 and into chapter 6, praying, they pray out loud. The religious leader make a show of it. Go into your closet. It's not about you. It's not about people seeing you do it. It's about your relationship with God. Be faithful and do it for the sake of being faithful and good, not for accolades. Giving. Be generous with your giving, but don't do it to garner power and attention from others. We get the story of the contrast between the kingdom of the religious and the kingdom of God in, you've heard it said, an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth. But I say to you, turn the other cheek. Go the extra mile. Give them your coat as well as your shirt. Go out of your way to do good and to bless those people who are trying to hurt you. See, the law was never about just giving us a box to check off. It's always been about changing of our heart. And so Jesus could say, yeah, you haven't committed adultery or murder, but have you thought it in your heart? Have you wished ill on that person? Because that means that there's still something inside of you that needs to change. Because the kingdom of God is not about checking boxes. Because if you're just checking boxes and filling your life with religiousness, you're like a house that's built on sand. Your peace is easily stolen from you. Your joy is easily stolen from you. Because when people don't add up, we can lose faith. Because when the storms of life come, well, we go, why? Because God blessings looks like no pain and no heartache and no problems. Jesus says no. Blessed are the poor in spirit. Blessed are the persecuted. But if we are basing our religion on a transaction with God, if we are basing our faith on what we can do, we can lose that peace and that joy. Jesus is saying here, seek first the kingdom of God. Focus on God. Let God get deeper into us. Let him take us to the uncomfortable places where I can sit there and say, yeah, I've never murdered. Yes, but do you do good to those who annoy you, who anger you, who frustrate you? Do you do good to those who just really, you can't see eye to eye? Because they're stealing your joy. They're stealing your peace. When you sit there and rant against them in your heart, when you don't let forgiveness take over, you give them space in your head and your heart, and it destroys you and your relationship. So the question is, what kind of house are we building? Are we building a house that looks good on the outside because we can sit there and check all those religious boxes? Or are we building a house that lets God and the Spirit of God dig deep inside us and produce a love, a mercy, a kindness, a generosity that goes against the logic of our world and even the logic of religion? It takes us to a deeper place, because that's where God's peace that passes all understanding can be experienced. Oh, it's already ours. It's just that we don't experience it because we let all this other baggage, this good stuff, fill our lives rather than letting the Spirit of God fill our lives. We're getting full on the bread and the breadsticks. Jesus has a main course for us that is worth saying no to some of the breadsticks. Jesus has a main course for us that has peace that rides out the storm, that gives joy that rides out the storm, that allows us to be free to love each other. When the storms of life are rocking our relationships and rocking us, let's go back to the Sermon on the Mount and say, what house am I building? Is the Spirit building this faith with a deep experience of God? Or I let him challenge my attitude, the unforgiveness, my temper, my selfishness? Do I let the Spirit take me deeper to give me a foundation so I can weather the storm? Because that's the promise of Christianity. The kingdom of God is like a house built on the rocks and can weather the storm. It's in following the Spirit of God leading us in the teachings of Christ to go deeper in our faith. May it be so.